You both have a very strong love for New York City and the people who live and work here. And you both head up different organizations, but both organizations really look to flourishing New York City. And MAS primarily through the built environment, and Redeemer through the spiritual environment.
And we both moved here in the 80s.
That's right.
By the way.
And yes, both of you are real veterans of New York City here. But you both organizations strongly understand that a livable New York City doesn't happen unless you collaborate at all different levels. And I think that's something that really is a shared value. And I wanted to just start off by, let me first ask in the audience, it's a little bit dark, but how many of you have lived here for at least 25 years here in New York City? Okay, so it's definitely the minority of people here. And as Tim alluded, they've both lived here 25 years for Tim, 30 years for Margaret. And my first question to the both of you is, what's changed in those 25, 30 years? And I think especially for those of us who have been here less than that amount of time, it's just really interesting to see how the city has really shifted over these past few decades.
Well, we were talking in the green room earlier, and I think one of the things we both agreed on, which is a kind of extraordinary transformation, I think both of the physical space and the sort of personal space that we all exist in, which is we feel safer, I think, on the streets. The sort of crime and just general kind of grunginess of the city has kind of improved enormously. I wasn't here in the 70s, but literally parts of New York were burning. One of the things that I do remember from the 80s, the subways look very, very different. I'm sure you've probably seen, there was a wonderful show at the Museum of the City of New York not that long ago on graffiti.
Yeah.
And the subway trains, you would be in a station and the trains would roll in, and they were actually incredible. You're talking about creativity. They were magnificent, but they were defaced property, and it really was contributing, I think, to a general deterioration of the subway. But one of the things that you don't see now is guardian angels. And those of you who were, it was a kind of vigilante group, I suppose. Curtis Lee was still around and talking. But the notion of protecting citizens, protecting each other from criminal activity was a sort of very fascinating time. But not so safe.
Right.
In many neighborhoods, you couldn't walk. As a woman traveling alone in the city, I think I often felt endangered.
I think we also said how expensive it's become. There's always been, that's the other big change. There's always been wealthy. There's always been wealth here, and there's always been wealthy areas. But you didn't have to spend about 20 minutes getting out of getting into areas where the rents are lower. There were always mixture. Certainly, Manhattan itself had plenty of both poor and rich and middle class neighborhoods. You had, frankly, more economic diversity.
Yeah.
And they were closer in. It wasn't like all of Manhattan was unaffordable and half of Queens, and you have to go all the way out. There were both poor middle class, poor working class, middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy neighborhoods, and that seems to have gone away too.
Mm-hmm. I think there's another thing that, just in terms of thinking about our built environment, the waterfront areas were pretty desolate 25 years ago. I think those of you that are relatively new to the city probably think the Hudson River Park always looked like that. And for those of us that were around in the 80s, we had the residue of what was called Art on the Beach. Anybody remember Art on the Beach? There's an organization called Creative Time, and at one point Battery Park City was not there in the 80s. And all of the landfill from the World Trade Center, when the first incarnation, the towers, when they excavated, they put all the fill into the Hudson River, and at the edge there was literally a giant bunch of sand dunes, and artists were basically turned loose to make art on the beach, so to speak, and it was pretty amazing. But there was nothing. It was just sort of abandoned and collapsing warehouses, piers. It was inaccessible. The West Side Highway was, I'm not sure when it was taken down, but it used to be an elevated highway. And parts of it, it was sort of like the FDR, so you had to go under it, and there was nowhere to go anyway, so no one went under the highway. And that was an area of drug dealing, prostitution, in the sort of where the meat market, Gansevoort, is now.
Yep.
And Tim, how about the spiritual environment here when you first came? What was that like 25 years ago that I think has really changed pretty dramatically?
Well, I actually, yes, one of the big changes in the last 25 years is you're sitting in it, or at least what this represents. The building you're in represents the fact that there is there's been a pretty good growth of new, what you might call the new churches. A.R. Bernard of the Christian Cultural Center out in Brooklyn, his church, by the way, is about the same age as our church. I don't know, they have 30,000 people or something like that. What we would say is you had traditional churches. You always had the mainline churches. You had the African American churches. But in the last 30 years, I mean, actually in the last 50 years, frankly, out in the boroughs, those new churches planted by non-Western missionaries, basically, and then the new churches that have developed in New York, in Manhattan, over the last 20 years, definitely, it's still not on a lot of people's radars, but there's been a big change there, definitely. We know that there's at least 3 times more people going to Protestant churches in Manhattan than there were 20 years ago. It's like tripled. So there's that's a change too.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing within the scope of just a few decades, just how much change happens, and these changes don't happen by accident, especially in a complex city like New York. There's a lot of deliberate intention behind the kind of changes that people want to see. And so, as you look at our time today, where do you see a lack of imagination in your respective world? Just, these are the places that really we wish we could develop, but we don't see the imagination there to be able to propel that kind of change into the future. So.
I love that question. I think I think that people are talking now, there's a lot of discussion about sort of authenticity in neighborhoods, and I think that people value small businesses, local businesses, and I think there is a real desire to keep those intact because they're meaningful to neighborhoods. They represent some of the things that we both want to hold on to and that we value as community. And I think there has not yet been a really imaginative solution about how there's a sort of intersection of economic forces which are quite destructive on some of those local businesses. There's pressures there's a story I read recently about the Kingsbridge Armory which is being developed, and local businesses can't afford to stay there because the real estate interests are feeling or raising rents because of the projected growth around there. So this is happening all over the city, and I don't think we've come up collectively with a good solution that's going to make us, content with this. So I think that's one place. The other thing I would say, how many of you voted? I hope you all voted in the election recently. It was a very small turnout. But our ballots, for those of you that voted, are one of the most extraordinary places of lack of imagination that I have seen recently. They look like they're, from the 50s or something? Terrible.
I'm really glad to hear that that you're thinking about these. I think the average New Yorker feels the same way, and feels sometimes that the people who are in office or in charge of the city are maybe not wrestling with the things that I hear you wrestling with. it's encouraging. Because I do think if you've been here for a while, I do think those of you who may be new to the city, it obviously you can't see those changes that Margaret was just talking about, but they're, I think, significant, and they hurt us. Since you asked about in my world, you said innovation in my world. Of course, that's the church world. And come on, David. I mean, there is no innovation in the church world. I mean, well, seriously, I'll dump on us for a little bit. The last thing to change in a neighborhood is the church. I mean, when I got here 25 years ago, we started meeting on the east side, and so from Lexington to the park was always the sort of silk stocking. It was very waspy, but from the 40s until about the 80s, from Lexington Avenue to the East River on the east side was basically Eastern Central European, lots of German, Hungarian, lots of Czech people. By the time I got there, they were kind of aging, but it was more blue collar and Eastern Central European. And even then in the 80s, the only Germans that were left there were some German restaurants, and most of the churches still had older German people in them. And they weren't reaching out to the new people who were in the neighborhood because there were no Germans in the neighborhood. They were basically young urban professionals. But the churches were still in the hands of the people who were in there 30 or 40 years ago. They're nice people, they're well-meaning people, but churches are the last thing to change and that's one of the reasons, by the way, why our Catholic friends are having to close the two Hungarian churches in the east side, which they just recently said we're going to have to close, didn't change. They didn't change with the time. So in general, the church is just terrible in innovation, utterly terrible. I'll just say one other thing is that for many, many years, even though most people in America were not devout religious people, but there was always a lot of folks that you would call they had an inherited faith. That means to say they grew up in a church or a synagogue. Their people. Religion was sort of part of their general communal identity, and that's going away. So in other words, you either are really religious or you're not at all. But there was always very irreligious people and very religious people, and then there was this great canopy of folks who thought religion was a good idea and felt always a little bit guilty that they weren't more religious. They're gone away, and as a result, the culture used to say that though most people said, I'm not religious, but I think religion's a good thing. Today, more and more people say, I'm not religious, and I actually think religion is a problem. And that's a new cultural situation, and I know that the churches do not know how to communicate. They get in that situation. They get strident. They do not seem to know how to reach out and serve their neighbors. They feel embattled. Yeah. So I think we have a long, long way to go. And in my area, I just see a complete lack of innovation and creativity. So.
Well, I think both of you are touching on this aspect of, it's increasingly difficult to live in the city because of the rising costs. And I know MAS is diverting a lot of attention to this issue, and yet you're kind of bemoaning the fact that there's not more imagination, and such a critical issue for all of us. Anyone living in the city, it's always a matter of how long will we be able to sustain living here. And why do you think there is such a lack of imagination when it's an issue that affects every New Yorker? I mean, unless you're part of the real elite where money is no issue, but that's probably not most of the people, at least in this room, and for most New Yorkers in general. So what accounts for that lack of imagination when it's such a pervasive issue?
That's a tough question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is it.
Maybe I sort of come around to talk about that a little bit differently. I think that, you mentioned the sort of lack of imagination in terms of churches, and we've been thinking a lot about this sort of reimagination of something we've been talking about as the Civic Commons. And by that we mean, I think everyone knows everyone who's studied history knows that there were commons in most American cities where everyone grazed the sheep and you could come out and talk to people. There are churches, there are more recently post offices, courthouses, even schools that functioned as places for kind of communal activities. And I think increasingly we find that not only do we not have those spaces, but they're being repurposed for other things, which might be a good thing, but we also don't know exactly where to locate our kind of communal and what are the civic places, what are the places where we come together to talk about what we believe in. So I think there's a difficulty sort of envisioning one, how you control those things, and I think some of the, I know when I used to, I've taught design over the years, and one of the most amazing things to me was when I taught design and architectural history and planning to non-architects, people who weren't design thinkers, and we would go out to like at the end of Canal Street where there's the Manhattan Bridge and there's this sort of ceremonial archway that takes you across the Manhattan Bridge. And we would say, you know, what do you think of this space? And we would talk about how important it was as a sort of civic space, and talk about, you know, what do you think about your neighborhood? What do you think about the doorway to your building? And all of a sudden people would say, wow, you mean I can comment on that? I can talk about that? I could actually influence that? And so I think, you know, I think part of it is people coming around to realizing that they actually can influence these things if you stop to think about it. It doesn't take experts. It takes intention and it takes commitment.
Yeah, and
That's pretty exciting to a church leader to hear, because I know we could not only participate in that, but we could probably help make that happen.
I think so.
But we are talking to each other. There's a tendency, not only the church leaders don't talk to each other, other church leaders, but they very often don't talk to the civic leaders. And but actually, that's a pretty exciting idea. So.
well, as we now like to transition, looking towards the future, and you know, what innovations would you love to see 25 years from now? I mean, the city has changed so dramatically.
That one.
Yes. So.
I would.
That would be great,
It
right?
would be.
Yeah.
It would be. And it might actually, we were talking, we already had, by the way, the best conversation back in the green room, so letting you.
You guys are getting the scraps,
Well,
I guess, here, yeah.
the problem of economic diversity, maintaining economic diversity, is a huge, huge problem. And I think we would both love to see some innovation that would tackle that, because it's not a simple, it's not like the government just has to regulate more, or the government can't possibly subsidize all that. And yet, of course, most people would say market forces are driving this thing. But we all know I mean, maybe Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand of the market force. The fact is, it's people. It's people deciding to raise the rents, and it's people doing this. So there would have to be some kind of collective will where everybody got together to try to do something about it. I don't see how that would happen unless you renovate the Civic Commons. So, I mean, to me, the means, it could be what we already just talked about, might be the main, at least, I don't know what we would do. It would take collective will, that takes the Civic Commons. Then what we would come up with, I have no idea what the innovations would be. But I think that would be what I'd most want to see in the future. So.
I like that. After we build Penn Station, right?
Yes, please.
Couple of new tunnels under the Hudson, that would be useful too. High-speed rail, I don't know, a couple things like that.
If you want to see Penn Station, I think it's Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert in A Night to Remember. And there's a great 1930s story about Claudette Colbert trying to catch a train to Miami out of New York City, and she goes to, there's a lot of great shots of Penn Station, and it just makes you weep.
No.
It just makes you weep. Because this idea of the Civic Commons, you do have to have spaces where people feel like those spaces make you want to be part of a greater body than just New York. Basically, I think New York encourages people to come here as individuals and say, forget about everybody else. I'm here to pad my resume. I'm here to follow my dream. And they don't see themselves as being part of the body politic. They don't see themselves as being part of something bigger. Those buildings helped you feel like you were with others and part of something bigger here. So I do hope we can do something about that. So I won't watch that movie and weep all the time.
Well, thank you both for just sharing your thoughts with us. You join me as we just thank Tim and Margaret.